I'm going to read my poem titled Orestes, which was inspired by a retirement dinner party that I attended in the 1990s for a Chicago policeman. Um, and the poem consists mainly of conversation among the policemen who were at the party. Um, the poem was also inspired by a section of the book two of the Iliad, which describes or names it in the form of a long list. It names warriors who traveled from Greece to the Trojan War. So most of the conversation among the policemen concerns Minnie Minoso, who was a great baseball player for the Chicago White Sox in the 1950s and 60s, Minnie Minoso. And something that a lot of people don't know about Minnie Minoso is that the name Minnie was only a nickname, and that his real name was Orestes. And the title of this poem is Orestes. These were the policemen, retired and active, accompanied by their wives, who, like a great flock of birds, attended Frank Umschlager's retirement dinner at the Cucina Albanese, and their laughter reverberated off the ceiling until the night wound down with Al Jablonski saying a few words, and then Frank Umschlager said a few words himself at the end of the night. It showed respect for Frank Umschlager how representatives of all 24 police districts were there, although in Frank Umschlager's career, Frank Umschlager had not actually worked in all 24 districts, but in the districts where he did work, he crossed paths with officers who moved on to other districts. So the upshot was officers from all the districts attended that night. There was some horseplay among the policemen as they greeted one another, laughingly playing some grab ass, as the wives also exchanged hellos, but the wives in a quieter way, because the wives didn't really know each other that well, and because most of them would just as soon have stayed home, but they were there in Frank Umschlager's honor because they were the wives of policemen. As when a great flock of birds lands in the trees, the policemen sat down at the tables designated for their respective police districts, each policeman accompanied by his wife, and then the waiters, who seemed to appear out of nowhere, filled their water glasses, took their drink orders, and offered the appetizers of minestrone soup, bruschetta, or crab cakes, which was the most popular appetizer. At the table of the 01 district, there was Bob Dreyer, whose father, Dub Dreyer, worked for many years in the old Area South Detective Division when it was the private fiefdom of Lieutenant Slick Negranada. Joe Bona was also at the 01 table, and so were Ravko Michovic, Herb Bevins, Phil Trimosowicz, all of them accompanied by their wives that night, like a great flock of birds, at the Cucina Albanese. Ravko Michovic, the gray-haired man, retired now from 01, where he worked patrol for many years, he opened his mouth and he said, "I remember going to Sox Park as a kid when there was a late innings pitcher's duel with no score until Minnie Minoso came up to bat, and I prayed for a home run on the next pitch, and he hit it over the fence. And ever since that day, I believe in God. From 02 came Barney Lanham and his wife, Angelo Canizario and his wife, Al Louderman and his wife, Konstantin Geekus and his wife, Gene Feebig and his wife, and Kevin Bacina, Ed Gleniski, Carl Deutsch, Bob Leentz, Sal Manis, Jimmy Nightco, John Papala, and Gus Cato Mariosis, all of them accompanied by their wives, as was Edward Jesovic, accompanied by his wife. From the 03 district came Jim Capezius, who was the boss of the shooting range and who in all his years on the street never was forced to fire his gun. But now at the shooting range, he taught what he never had to do in the street. But when he opened his mouth, no one doubted he could have done it if the occasion had arose. He lived in Norwood Park, as many policemen do. Besides Jim Capezius and his wife at the table for 03 were these police officers, all of them accompanied by their wives. Frank Latalia, Archie Malhote, John Lasser, Ben Garcia, Bill Davis, Ralph Maruska, Joe Katarabek, Dave Lansky, and Al Love, whose father Milton had worked in the old Area North Detective Division when it was the private fiefdom of Lieutenant Artie Epler. From the 04 district, which is called the Quad, there came Tim Leidy, Lou Palmer, Bob Gankars, Sam Chichester, Kurt Glinsky, and their wives, all under the unofficial leadership of Lee Kopak, the gray-haired man who opened his mouth and said, if they had had designated hitter in Minnie Minoso's day, he would still be playing, and he would be in the Hall of Fame by now. Some from the 04 drank beer as they ate appetizers, and there was wine for the ladies. But most of these policemen from the Quad drank rum and Coke in honor of Minnie Minoso. Kurt Glinsky, the gray-haired man, opened his mouth and said, the Green Olive had beanbag sessions on Monday nights where Minnie Minoso used to drink a whole big pitcher full of rum and Coke. Kurt Glinsky continued, if you want to drink a drink as a drink ought to be made, if you want to play pool, if you want to drink alone or with 6 of your friends, if you want a perfect jukebox, if you want to watch belly womping or want to belly womp yourself, the Green Olive is the place for you. Minnie Minoso was a regular, and he could have gone anywhere else in Chicago, but he was a regular at the Green Olive. What about the 05? That night, the 05's delegation was led by Bud Budnick, the gray-haired man, accompanied by his wife. He had worked third shift for the bulk of his career. Vic Fantozzi, Steve Gerdzius, Leo Youngers, Hank Fehrenbach, Bill Antoniuk, Jake Fennessy, Dick Grubelski, Pat Moonen, and their wives rounded out the 05 delegation like a great flock of birds. Then the waiters cleared the appetizers' remnants, and the main courses of the night were announced, which were the lasagna, or the rigatoni gorgonzola, the chicken rotolini, or the linguine with clam sauce. John Zarnik of the '06 table wanted the lasagna, and his wife, and also as did his wife, and also as did Gene Huggentugler and his wife, and Mike Davros and his wife, but Jerry Frosch and his wife wanted the rotini. Moving on to the policeman from the '07, Big Joe Smolinarski was the leader of the pack, with his hair the color of iron gray like clouds over Lake Michigan on the winter mornings when Joe Smolinarski made extra money by snow plowing driveways. Joe Smolinarski was accompanied by his wife, as also were Mort Musk, George Henry, and Sid Millsaps. From the '08 there came Fred Lipkowitz, Elroy Baker, Luke Botica, Nick DiGiola, Walter Bednick, Wayne Burgess, Phil Delia, Bob Alangi, and Joe Furmanek, who told how Minnie Minoso's 65th birthday party was held at the old Calumet Beach Inn, and Minnie Minoso said, "I'm 65, but I'm still hitting them with the bases loaded." Representing the '09 that night, like a great flock of birds, were Stan Chalicki and his wife, Bob Donek and his wife, Al Dibich and his wife, and Pat Galvin, Sam Giusiosi, Phil Hess, and last but not least, Sergeant Guido Intellicato and his wife, as were Pat, Sam, and Phil, accompanied by their wives that night. Fred Coiter led the 010 delegation that included Tom Burris, Jake Conley, Vic Katsudis, Leo Riba, Bob Busick, Buddy Popko, and other policemen too numerous to mention, all of them accompanied by their wives. And as the evening wore on, the talk turned to how Minnie Minoso could do no wrong. Vic Katsudis then opened his mouth, the gray-haired man, and he said, "One time outside the old 2350 Club with Plush Falbo, and I knew he was up to something, but it was an unwritten rule how Minnie Minoso could do no wrong. I used to see him outside the bowling alley on Diversey." Leo Riba said, "Minnie Minoso got himself a pass in the 010 and all over Chicago, since the word came down from on high. He was a fair-haired boy, so to speak, on account of he was Minnie Minoso. We were told to look the other way if Minnie Minoso got involved in something, because the word came down from on high." From the 011, we had Walt Figler, Al Koenig, Hicks Baskin, Max Coffendaffer, and John Leckas, all of them accompanied by their wives. Hicks Baskin, the gray-haired man, said, "Except when he was playing baseball, Minnie Minoso never wore a baseball hat." Max Coffendaffer said, "Even on real hot days, Minnie Minoso never wore short pants." Regarding 012, it was the private fiefdom of Lieutenant Bob Hillis, who on this night had Phil Bruno, Tom Coyne, and Len Ficht as his entourage, all well along in years, and each man accompanied by his wife. Bob Hillis opened his mouth and said, "As a boy, I got a Mickey Mantle baseball card but what I really wanted was Minnie Minoso. Then, with a look of bemusement on his face, Bob Hillis continued and said, I traded Mickey Mantle to Fuzz Voigt, who now works in the sanitation department, for Minnie Minoso card. And I never gave it as much as a second thought. Phil Bruno said, if I had to do it all over, I might join the sanitation department. But a lot of those guys are big time booze hounds, understandably. Just as in many office buildings there is no 13th floor, or in cities there is no 13th Street, there is no 013 district in the Chicago Police Department. So we skip now to the 014 district, which is bounded by Elston Avenue on the east, Division Street on the south, Belmont Avenue on the north, and Central Park Avenue on the west. From 014 came Bob Seska, Chuck Risco, George Rambold, Pete Kula, Bill Lewis, Gene Podgorniak, and Louis Rapman, all of them accompanied by their wives. Bob Seska, the gray-haired man, was always warmly greeted by police officers because of Bob Seska's annual parties on Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. His annual parties were in Bob Seska's large backyard, and all the police officers were automatically invited along with their wives, asking only that everyone pitch in some food or a drink item, and in all the years of all the parties, only once had there ever been a rainout, at which time everyone transferred to inside the house. It was a tradition at Bob Seska's party that at some point during the party, when everyone was feeling good, that Bob took out an old record player and played an old record of military marching songs, like Anchors Aweigh, the Marines' hymn, Over There, and Off We Go into the Wild Blue Yonder. When the music started, everybody would sing along and then march around the outside of Bob Seska's backyard, or on the occasion when the annual party was rained out, they marched around Bob Seska's living room and even spilled over into the kitchen and the dining room. Usually, besides the police officers, there would be some local celebrities at Bob Seska's annual parties, like an ex-Notre Dame football player, or old Cubs or White Sox players, such as Mo Drabowski, who in his career actually played for both the Cubs and the White Sox at one time or another. But over the years, Mo Drabowski became persona non grata among the policemen at Bob Seska's parties because Mo Drabowski never brought Minnie Minoso to a party, and the policemen were seeing to each other how Mo Drabowski needed a kick in the ass, since he never brought Minnie Minoso, because of which he needed a kick in the ass. We proceed to the 015 table, where a waiter found Ed Barnes, Sam Cognato, Pup Erickson, Bob Gans, Mike Kozumic, and their wives, to whom the waiter reiterated how the main courses were the lasagna, the rigatoni gorgonzola, the linguine with clam sauce, or the chicken rotolini on this evening. Sam Cognato shrugged his shoulders as if to say, what difference does it make? He ordered the rigatoni. Mike Kozumic, Ed Barnes, and Pup Erickson had lasagna. Bob Gans, the gray-haired man, said Minnie Minoso used to call the Black Angus and say, I like to eat, and I'm not afraid to pay for it, so I'm coming over in 20 minutes. Mike Kozumic, the gray-haired man, was something of a walking encyclopedia, and he said, was that the old Black Angus in Arlington Heights? Uncle Andy's Cow Palace on Harlem Avenue was a good restaurant, and Leone's on Lake Street in Melrose Park was a good restaurant, as was Toscano's at 2439 South Oakley Avenue in Chicago. Mike Kazumlik went on, the Millionaires Club on South Wabash Avenue was Minnie Minoso's old stomping ground, despite the fact of how the clientele in the Millionaires Club was all stumblebums, mooching after the boiled eggs, turkey, chicken, ham, bread rolls, and soup at the free salad bar. The salad bar itself was actually invented in a town called Plover in Wisconsin. From 016 were Tom Menzie, Sub Peterson, John McRory, Pat Osusik, Fred Krenzer, Randy Jedlick, Hank Hubley, and Lee Gips, all of them accompanied by their wives. Tony Menzie opened his mouth and said, "When I worked in traffic, the Bryn Mawr exit off the outer drive was considered to be a real gold mine by a lot of guys." Tony Menzie continued, "One night I pulled over Minnie Minoso, who was going about 70 miles an hour. I said, 'Hey, Minnie, where are you going in such a hurry?' He said, 'I'm going to see my girlfriend.' He got a pass for being Minnie Minoso, but the Bryn Mawr exit off the outer drive was like shooting fish in a barrel." The 017 was represented by Mike Black, Roy Delafield, Ed Gilwa, Kurt Coonley, Alphonse Irgang, and Rudy Kochendorf, all of them accompanied by their wives. Ed Gilwa said, "Years ago I worked with the great Artie Epler in the old Area North Detective Division when it was at Belmont and Western Avenue." Mike Black opened his mouth and said, "In the old days, you know who else was at the Area North Detective Division? Marty Klemko. But he was withering on the vine. He was a policeman's policeman, but he was hamstrung for years because Artie Epler, for all his good qualities, refused to let him show what he could do." Now we leave the 017 table and go to 018 table, where the fine police officers Will Brode, Neem Sansino, Walt Cruz, Francis Kotami, and Joe Bliss were eating and talking good-naturedly to each other, as their wives also talked good-naturedly among themselves, so that the two groups were more or less oblivious of one another. Francis Kotomi, the gray-haired man, said, "I don't like this terminology of the so-called Viagra Triangle, which to me is nothing but glorifying the old Rush Street nightlife area of small fry out-of-town tourists here for the sales conventions. I don't know about Viagra, but those dumb hicks drank beer on Rush Street for $15 a bottle." Joe Bliss explained to Francis Katomi, "It's called the Viagra Triangle because Rush Street, State Street, and Chicago Avenue form a triangle, and the men there take Viagra." Will Brode then huffed and puffed and said, Minnie Minoso didn't care about Viagra." Walt Cruz huffed and puffed and said, "Minnie Minoso didn't know what Viagra was." At the table, accompanied by fine policemen of the 019 district, they were Matt Corey, Bert Hesser, Lester Gonkars, Mike Torres, Abe Frick, and Doug Nider, all of them accompanied by their wives. Abe Frick said, "Minnie Minoso had great admiration for Judge Abraham Lincoln Marovitz. who was an old-time dyed-in-the-wool Sox fan. Abe Frick, the gray-haired man, went on, when Judge Abraham Lincoln Merovitz administered the oath of office to the first Mayor Daley, Minnie Minoso held the Bible, because at that time in 1955, the Sox were at the height of their powers, and the mayor was every bit as big a White Sox fan as was Judge Abraham Lincoln Merovitz. We move now to the 020 table, which was populated by these fine policemen and their wives. Jake Skinkley, Ben Knudsen, Marv Bredge, Larry Cluck, Luther Meeks, Dennis Porthmoe, and Cam Shoemaker, whose years on the street were finished, and now he sat behind a desk at the 020 interviewing applicants for liquor licenses. As for the policemen of 021, these men, whose names were Jim Mudd, Bo Jench, Leo Marubio, Al Gronow, Herb Semelius, Ed Jellick, Hank Sinclair, and Bobby Minkus, all of them accompanied by their wives, they were finishing their main courses and were getting ready for the dessert of either tiramisu or New York-style cheesecake. So too were the policemen from the 022, Earl Tanner, Billy Kleinholtz, Steve Frangos, and the O'Shea brothers, Bob and Michael, all of them accompanied by their wives. They too were looking at the desserts of tiramisu or New York-style cheesecake, of which the cheesecake was chosen by most of the policemen and their wives. Steve Frangos said, Minnie Minoso always ordered stuffed shrimp anywhere we ate. Every single time, like clockwork, he ordered stuffed shrimp, and the funny part was how I started ordering stuffed shrimp myself. And it got to the point where whenever the two of us walked into a restaurant, they automatically gave both of us stuffed shrimp. At the 023 were Frank Fleischlieber, Mike Birchmore, Press Clark, Sam DeSauer, Sal Davino, Vic Formuliam, Bruno Miltzau, and Hap Magnus. And each of those policemen, those gray-haired men of the 023, who were accompanied by their wives like a great flock of birds, they had the cheesecake. Every one of them had the cheesecake. So too did Herman Konevsky of the 024 have the cheesecake. The gray-haired man had the cheesecake, as did Jack Gromnick, Vern Halwick, Stan Joswiak, Mike McCarthy, Theo Van Breems, Am Buba, Dave Kuzda, and Bob Kyle. They had the cheesecake. All of them accompanied by their wives, and the wives, too, had the cheesecake. Now, Frank Unschlager was stopping by all the tables, and he was having a few laughs at each table, and then he would move on to the next table, until finally at the last table, he came to the 024, and the aforementioned Jack Gromnick, Vern Halwick, Stan Joswiak, Mike McCarthy, Theo Van Breems, Am Buba, Dave Kuzda, Bob Kyle, and Herman Konevsky. Herman Konevsky sang, for he's a jolly good fellow, as Frank Umschlager dropped by the 024 table, as he had dropped by all the tables that evening. And then while the waiters were pouring coffee for the policeman of 024, Al Jablinski stationed himself at the front of the room, and when he banged a spoon on a glass, a silence descended, as when a great fish descends under the water. Frank Umschlager also fell silent. No longer was Frank Umschlager sharing a few laughs at the 024 table as he realized that Al Jablinski was going to say a few words, and then he himself, Frank Umschlager, the man of the hour, would say a few choice words on his own as the silence kept descending, like when a great flock of birds lands all at the same time in a deserted cornfield. Al Jablinski, the gray-haired man, opened his mouth and said, "Considering how much we all dislike Frank, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. The streets of Chicago are a lot safer with all you dingbats here in one place. But seriously, we love Frank, as we love his wife, albeit from a distance. So here's a real quick recap of Frank's career. For the past 30 years, Frank Umschlager had been running down leads, making arrests, breaking down doors, pulling his gun on people, and logging overtime whenever he possibly could. The upshot is Frank Umschlager may not embody what a Chicago policeman is supposed to be, but God help us if he embodies what a Chicago policeman actually is. Hey, I'm just kidding you, Frank. Then Al Jablonski took a glass off a table and raised it and said, "Congratulations, Frank. You're a good man, my friend." He took a sip of whatever was in his glass, as did the other policemen around the room, even if there was only water in their glasses. And as this was happening, Frank Umschlager stepped up and shook hands with Al Jablonski. As Al Jablonski slipped away, Frank Umschlager addressed all the policemen gathered there, all of them accompanied by their wives. He addressed the policemen with a sincere tone of voice. He seemed pretty calm, but then as he continued, his voice choked up a little, so he had to get control of himself before he could start to speak again, which he did. He took a drink of water, and then he said, "In German, the name Umschlager means to beat around the bush, which is funny since I don't like to beat around the bush. So it's like calling a tall guy shorty or a fat guy skinny, because it really means the opposite. Umschlager means to beat around the bush, but I don't like to beat around the bush." Frank Umschlager then said, "Be that as it may, people have no idea what being a policeman is really like. You're putting your life on the line every day, whether it's ticketing a nice old lady in Lincoln Park or locking up stumble bums, jack rollers, the mopes, lowlifes, or whatever you guys who work the wagon third shift, as I did for 5 years, you know what I mean." Frank Umschlager went on, "You want to know something else that people have no idea about, which is the furthest thing from their minds as they go along their merry way? People have no idea about the importance of Minnie Minoso to the Chicago Police Department. They don't have idea number one about how Minnie Minoso is on our minds every second as Chicago policemen. If you were to ask Mr. Joe Citizen of Chicago, 'Do you see those policemen in that squad car?' What do you think they're talking about right now?" I can promise you the answer that you will get would not be that they're talking about Minnie Minoso, but they probably were talking about Minnie Minoso, because Minnie Minoso is what being a policeman means from your first day at the police academy. Why is Minnie Minoso so important to us as policemen? And why is Minnie Minoso so important to me personally as a policeman? I'll tell you a couple of quick stories. I got into a fight at the DMV on Elston Avenue, and while I was there, I saw Minnie Minoso at a desk attempting to renew his driver's license, and there appeared to be some problem going on. So I walked over and I said, "What's the problem?" The woman said he can't read the eye test letters, which were on the wall behind her because of how Minnie Minoso was pretty old at that time. So I said, "Let's try it again." And then I read the letters myself, and I said he did it. And she said he didn't do it. So I said he did it. And she was going to bitch about it, so I looked at her again, and she shut up. I'm sure many of you also have your own such stories. Another time I was in the old Ann Satter's restaurant on Belmont Avenue, and I saw Minnie Minoso standing by a table eating the smorgasbord, or whatever it was. And then a guy comes and says, "Hey, that's my food. I just went to the bathroom." The guy was bitching. So I went over there and I said, "What's the problem?" And the guy said, he's eating my food. I went to the bathroom and I came back and he's eating my food. So Minnie Minoso said, "I come from a poor country of Cuba and I don't like to see people waste any food." But the guy refused to take no for an answer, and he said, "I wasn't wasting it. I went to the bathroom." So I said, "He doesn't like to see people waste food." And the guy was bitching about it, so I looked at him and he shut up. I said, "Here's your smorgasbord," and I felt like sticking his head in the smorgasbord. At that point, Frank Umschlager took a deep breath, so it looked like he might start to cry, but he didn't. He took another drink of water, and then he said, "Another time I was at the Sox game on opening day, and they introduced Minnie Minoso, before the game. There were some high school kids standing there. They were laughing, so I said, 'What's so funny?' And one of them said, 'Minnie is a girl's name, like Minnie Mouse.'" Frank Umschlager went on, "Another kid that Minnie could mean something little, like a miniskirt." So I told him I didn't think that was funny, and how I was going to straighten them out about what people don't know about Minnie Minoso. Frank Umschlager took another drink of water, and he looked across the room at the policemen, all of whom were accompanied by their wives. He then went on, "But everybody in this room already knows what I told those young kids. Look at Joe Smolinarski over there from the 07. He knows what I told those young kids." Frank Umschlager said, as he pointed his finger in a very friendly way at Joe Smolinarski, the gray-haired man, who then nodded his head slowly, like an old gray horse. Frank Umschlager continued, "Look at Al Gronow over there from 021. How are you doing, Al? Al Gronow knows what I'm getting at now." "Hell yes, Al Gronow knows what I told the kids at Sox Park when Minnie Minoso was introduced." Whereupon Pup Erickson from the 015 leaped up like a great fish jumping out of the water, and he said, "Orestes Minoso, Orestes Minoso." After that, it was Gene Podgorniak's turn. The gray-haired man from 014 leaped up like a great fish and said in a loud voice, his real name was Orestes Minoso. Then other policemen who were there, such as Lee Gibbs and Walter Bednick and Jake Skinkley, leaped up and said his real name was Orestes Minoso. Frank Umschlager finally began to cry, and he said, "Orestes Minoso," and they were all yelling, "Orestes Minoso, Orestes Minoso." Steve Gerdzoulias, Sam Giustolizzi, Gene Feeberg, and they all marched around the room, all of them accompanied by their wives, like a great flock of birds, and their laughter reverberated off the ceiling of Cucina Albanese.